Okay, so there are a lot of sort of terms and facts relating to the composition of blood, and I just want to say at the outset that, of course, you can use your study card when we have, the test, the major assessment for this unit, but um, I am not going to ask you, and you'll see that reflected on the test preview. I'm not going to ask you a lot of nitpicking questions about details relating to the composition of blood because you could fill a book with information about the composition of blood. So key parts, and we'll outline some of those in the slides coming up, and understanding how some of those parts work together to carry out the functions the blood and the circulatory system have in our bodies. All right, so the blood is more or less 50-50 liquid or plasma and cells, chunks, bits of living stuff. And the plasma, the liquid part of the blood, when we talked about the functioning of capillaries and how some of the liquid part of the blood can intentionally seep out of the capillaries, this is the liquid part that we're talking about. The plasma is made mostly of water, and it has lots of stuff dissolved in that water, including ions, many of which are super important to the moment-to-moment functioning of our cells. Critical ions listed there: sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, chloride, and bicarbonate or hydrogen carbonate. And then at the bottom, other substances transported in the liquid part of our blood: nutrients, glucose, fatty acids, amino acids, those critical gases relating to the process of cellular respiration, oxygen and carbon dioxide. So those other small molecules also dissolved in the liquid part of our blood. And then there are some big molecules dissolved in our blood, the plasma proteins, and those typically cannot seep out of the blood because those big molecules can't fit through the tiny spaces that exist between the cells in the walls of our capillaries. So most of the plasma proteins stay inside the blood vessels all the time unless there's an injury to a blood vessel and we bleed. And then the cellular components outlined there, and we're going to talk about those at least briefly one by one. So pause the video here, but we've kind of touched on some of these things already. Here are components of our blood plasma, the liquid part of our blood. Two different types of blood cells predominate in our blood in terms of the cellular components of our blood. Red blood cells, which are all the same, essentially, and white blood cells, which come in lots of different varieties, and we'll touch on those today, but we'll talk lots about those when we talk about the immune system. And then these platelets that are mentioned on the slide. Platelets are sort of cells, but not really. They're little pieces of cells. And those platelets are critical to the process of blood clotting, which we will briefly talk about in just a minute. So red blood cells, our blood is red because of red blood cells. And they are by far the most numerous cells in the body. A tiny drop of blood can have 5 million red blood cells. An adult human, 20 to 30 trillion red blood cells. So absolutely essential. Oxygen is such an important part of our moment-to-moment needs in terms of supplying energy and doing cellular respiration to supply that energy. And because oxygen does not dissolve very well in water at all, we need some structures inside our blood to help carry oxygen. The red blood cells, lesser known, but also very important, also carry carbon dioxide. That's not a nutrient, of course, that's a waste product, but we have to get rid of that waste product because for every oxygen molecule we use during cellular respiration, we will produce at least one molecule of carbon dioxide. So we got to get rid of that. And the red blood cells play a huge role in carrying the carbon dioxide as well. And the molecule inside the red blood cells that actually does the binding and releasing of oxygen and the binding and releasing of carbon dioxide to carry those gases from where they may be picked up to where they may be dropped off. Hemoglobin does that job. The reason those cells have no nucleus is because there's really just one function for red blood cells, and that's to carry these gases, oxygen and CO2. And so we don't need a nucleus if basically that cell is not doing anything but serving as a transport mechanism for these gases. So get rid of the nucleus, which is normally the largest organelle in a cell, and that makes room for even more hemoglobin and even more ability to carry those gases. White blood cells, again, this is a broad category of different types of cells, and you can get down to some nitty and gritty and learn that there are lots and lots of different white blood cells, but they are all involved with defending our body. All right, blood clotting, and if you look at the slides, I've put some notes in below. Blood clotting is a super cool, really interesting, and somewhat complex bit of function. So our blood needs to be liquid and needs to flow for us to live. That's absolutely essential. And if a major blood vessel, especially if a major artery is cut, if our blood is not able to clot, is not able to stop flowing, then that can be a life or death situation within seconds to minutes. So blood clotting is this really fascinating thing where most of the time we don't want our blood to clot, and if it does, that can kill us. A blood clot in a blood vessel in the heart or in the brain can lead to a heart attack or a stroke, and that is potentially lethal. The other side of that, though, as I just mentioned, occasionally we have a situation where we have an injury to a blood vessel, and now if the blood does not clot, that becomes a life-threatening situation. So it is a very finely tuned balancing act. So the blood has to be ready to clot at all times, but we only want it to clot when it is absolutely necessary. So details of this you don't need to know. What you do need to know is that there are a couple of key things involved here. The platelets that we mentioned before, and then there are a bunch of different proteins that under normal circumstances, no injuries to the blood vessels, those proteins are just floating along in the blood, and they're soluble, they're dissolved, and they just independently are floating along in the blood. And then if the conditions are right, if certain conditions are met, then those proteins act very differently. They start sticking together, and they start forming a clot with the platelets and our red blood cells filling in the spaces that make up that clot. And I'm going to stop there because I didn't want to go into details, and I'm starting to go into details. If you're curious about this, this is potentially a really cool personal learning project you could do. And just to satisfy your own curiosity, there's some cool stuff to know about blood clotting. On the slideshow, there's a video linked up here where it says blood clotting at the top. And it's just a couple of minutes, so that could give you a clearer picture if you want to just take first steps at digging a little deeper. All right, last thing, we're going to mention the three biggies in terms of cardiovascular disease. Number one killer of human beings on the planet is cardiovascular disease. And the two biggest culprits in terms of death in humans would be heart attacks and strokes. And both of those can be caused by the first type of cardiovascular disease mentioned on the slide here, and that's atherosclerosis. Say that 10 times fast. And so we're gonna touch on atherosclerosis, and then I think most of you are at least vaguely familiar with heart attack and stroke, and we can dig deeper on those if we need to. But atherosclerosis is often the underlying cause of most cardiovascular diseases. So here is a picture on the left of a healthy artery. The lumen wall, the endothelium, is made up of these flattened cells, and it tends to be nice and smooth. The blood flows through there smoothly with lower resistance, and that keeps blood pressure at manageable levels, not too high. If there's an injury to the wall of the blood vessel, then we can start having what we call plaques build up on the walls. And those plaques can be made of cellular components of the blood, platelets, and potentially red blood cells, some of those proteins that I talked about, also some fatty deposits, and of particular importance are deposits relating to the proteins that carry around cholesterol in our blood. And if there is some injury in the wall of an artery and these plaques start to form, it's kind of a snowball effect where a little bit of stuff builds up in the wall of the artery that attracts other sticky bits in our blood, and what can start off to be a minor disruption of blood flow in an artery, it can progress to where you have a plaque like this, where now that vessel has maybe half the capacity to carry blood that it normally did. And if that plaque breaks off from the wall of the artery, then we have big trouble, because that plaque can move downstream in the artery and then into a smaller vessel, may completely block the flow of blood in that artery. And that's when you have potential for a heart attack or for a stroke. And again, those, as you are well aware, are very dangerous and potentially lethal events happening in our circulatory system. So that's atherosclerosis. Here are some bullets, things that you may have heard about if you have parents that are close to my age. They may be talking about their cholesterol and their lipid profiles in their blood and their HDL and their LDLs. That's because we know that these are indicators of healthy or not so healthy conditions in our circulatory system. The good and bad cholesterol that people talk about are not actually the cholesterol. Cholesterol is all the same. That's a fat molecule. And because cholesterol, like other fats, doesn't dissolve well in the liquid part of our blood, we have these proteins to help carry cholesterol and other lipids, other fats around in our blood. And the LDL is the bad cholesterol, because that particular type of protein is one of the ones that often sticks to those plaques as they start forming and growing in a blood vessel. So if you have a lot of the LDL proteins carrying cholesterol in your blood, you are much more likely to develop these plaques that can lead to heart attack or stroke. And then we've talked about blood pressure and the risks of high blood pressure. Just that constant stress on the walls of the arteries can be a place where a little tear, a little damage in the wall of an artery can be the start of a plaque. So chronic high blood pressure all the time, is called hypertension. And that is a very strong risk factor for cardiovascular disease and for things like heart attack and stroke. And luckily, we have some really effective drugs that can help regulate high blood pressure. And there are lots of things you can do lifestyle choices wise to help reduce your risk and reduce your blood pressure.